Okay, so yes, hi everyone. I'm Manuel, and I'm a master student at the University of Stuttgart and Aalto University. And the title of the talk that I want to give today is Multi-Fidelity Bayesian Machine Learning for Global Optimization, which is also what I've been doing for my as my master thesis project. And I've done this project externally in the Computational Electronic Structure Theory group at Aalto University in Helsinki under the supervision of Milica Todorovic, Joachim Löfgren, and Patrick Rinke. And from the side of the University of Stuttgart, I got supervised by Jörg Mein. Yes, so I will begin my talk with motivation. So in physics and in material science, we have the aim to study the arrangement of atoms and electrons, since the arrangement of determines many functional properties. And we're interested in studying those structures that are actually stable. But before we can study them, we have to find these energetically stable configurations first. And one established way of doing this is using this so-called method of Bayesian optimization, which has been designed to efficiently optimize an unknown function by generating samples from this unknown function. Now, in our scenario here, the unknown function is a potential energy surface that is spent over the degrees of freedom that some material system has. And we can use an atomistic simulator, which is based on quantum mechanics theory, to calculate accurate internal energies for given configurations. For example, in this figure here, for given dihedral angles, and by calculating several or the energy of several configurations, we can then model the potential energy surface reasonably well, which enables us to infer the global minimum. And the challenge or a big constraint that we still have here is that the calculation of potential energy energies at the quantum mechanical level can still be very expensive. And this raises the question if we can accelerate this Bayesian optimization procedure somehow. But before I'm going to speak about this in a bit more detail, I will give you an overview of my talk. So I will start with by talking about the theory and the methodology, where I'm going to explain the theory of Bayesian optimization and its application to structure search. And then I'm going to extend this to the multi-fidelity scenario where and also formulate my research questions. Then I will speak a bit more about technical work regarding computational implementation that was necessary to do this research. And finally, I will introduce a test scenario of multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization, where I'm going to compare different approaches and then also answer my research questions. So I will begin by telling you a little bit more about the underlying theory of Bayesian optimization and also why we use it as a method for structure search. And this brings me to BOSS, a tool that many of you are familiar with. So BOSS stands for Bayesian Optimization Structure Search. And BOSS is one can say, a general open source implementation of Bayesian optimization in Python, which has special support for the application in material science. And this tool, the software, is developed in the groups of Milica and Patrick. And BOSS solves this task that I just introduced you to find the global minimum on a potential energy surface. And it does this in an active learning strategy. And it also provides us a probabilistic model that we can also chemically interpret. So I will introduce you here to this workflow of Bayesian optimization now in a bit more detail. So we always start with some given data to which we then fit a model. And then the next step is that to evaluate some acquisition rule where we want to sample next on our configuration space. And this is basically an iterative procedure. So I'm going to start now with considering that we have given some data set with this model model construction. So in BOSS or in Bayesian optimization in general, we typically use a Gaussian process, which is actually a model over functions. So more formally speaking, a Gaussian process is a distribution over functions, which is characterized by a mean function and a so-called covariance function, or also called kernel function. And if we would imagine that we take many samples, we generate many functions from a Gaussian process, then the average over all functions would would correspond to the mean function, and the covariance function would describe the spatial variation between input points, or the level of smoothness that these sampled functions can have. And one typical example to choose as a kernel function is to use this so-called RBF kernel. Now, when we use Gaussian processes for regression, we always sample functions over a finite input domain. And this means that we sample from a multivariate Gaussian distribution, which is centered at mu and has the covariance matrix K. And in the right figure here, you see that without any given data, all functions that are within a certain range that is determined by this kernel function are possible functions that we allow to be used for modeling. And the samples here in this figure are generated from this so-called prior distribution. Now, once we have data that then we can condition our prior distribution on observation data, and then we obtain the so-called posterior distribution. And that means that once we have data, we restrict the space of possible functions to be used for modeling, and we require them that that the functions go through these data points. Even though this is optional that they go exactly through these data points, we can still add up on a certain variance if we wish to. And the further away we are from the data points, the larger our variance is. And so in practice, what we do is we condition this multivariate Gaussian distribution on this observation data, and then we obtain a new multivariate Gaussian distribution, which is characterized with this posterior mean and this posterior variance function. And in practice, we then use this posterior mean as our regression model, and this posterior variance provides us information about how confident our model is in its predictions. And this brings me now to the second key ingredient of Bayesian optimization, which is a strategy of how we choose to sample our unknown function. And this is done by the so-called acquisition function. So in general, we decide to obtain samples that are very informative for the global minimum inference. And yeah, we'll explain now what this means. So yeah, this acquisition function or rule is a decision, one can interpret it as a decision-making process to come up with some sampling strategy. And this is typically denoted with alpha. And in Bayesian optimization, we acquire our next sample by minimizing this function. So the x that for which we get the minimum acquisition function value would be the x that we then feed into our atomistic simulator and then repeat this procedure. Now in Bayesian optimization, the acquisition rule typically uses the posterior mean and the posterior variance function. And one successful heuristic approach is this so-called ELCB function, which is also quite easy to interpret, because here we just have two contributions by the posterior mean and by the posterior variance. And this alpha then gets small either if the mean function becomes small. So these are the low energy regions that we would be interested to learn about, or if the variance becomes large because there's a minus sign in front of the variance. So in regions of the search space where we don't have a lot of information yet. And we call this sampling in low energy regions exploitation, and in this unknown regions exploration. And this ELCB is a nice trade-off between these two phases. Now the ELCB is intuitive and easy to understand as an acquisition rule, but there exist other acquisition functions which are theoretically derived. For example, the class of so-called entropy search acquisition functions. Here the idea is the following: we treat our next sample and the unknown global minimum location both as random variables, and our target is to learn about the global minimum location. So we desire that the next sample should reduce the uncertainty about our global minimum as much as possible. And we can quantify this by using the mutual information. So the mutual information between two random variables quantifies how much information one obtains about one random variable if we would observe the other random variable. So what the entropy search acquisition function does is it's using the mutual information to construct an acquisition function. By the way, here this time we have to maximize the acquisition function instead of minimize it, because we want to maximize the information, this mutual information term. So here the mutual information is then the between the next sample and our unknown global minimum location. And it is then consists of two terms. so the entropy of the random variable or our unknown global minimum location minus the entropy over the global minimum location, given that we have a new observation that we put into our data set. And since we haven't evaluated the simulator at this location X at this moment, we need to calculate the expectation value for this next observed value Y by using the posterior Gaussian process model. The problem with this function is that it's it's computationally very expensive, because this probability distribution P of X star, where this X star is the global minimum location, this entropy calculation grows with the independence of the search space dimension, and this can make this acquisition function unfeasible for high dimensional systems. And one computational efficient variation of this entropy search function is the so-called max value entropy search. I'm not going to speak too much in detail about this, but there are two ideas here. The first is that we make use of the fact that the mutual information is symmetric in its input argument. So we basically, and the second one is that people in the Bayesian optimization community have, or heuristic experiments have shown that we can actually not use the global minimum location X, but also the global minimum value Y star. And this has provided quite similar success in Bayesian optimization experiments. And the nice thing here is that the global minimum value Y star is a one-dimensional property, because it's always an energy. It doesn't matter how many degrees of freedom we have in our system. And therefore, this acquisition function doesn't have this problem of the scalability. Now that we've talked a bit more in detail about these key blocks of Bayesian optimization, as I said before, we repeat this algorithm iteratively while we keep track of the global minimum prediction, and we continue this until either this prediction converges or until our computational budget is exhausted. And next I will come to this extension that I talked in the beginning about, from the single fidelity to the multi-fidelity scenario. So in the beginning, as I mentioned, this challenge that these simulations at the quantum mechanical level can be very costly to conduct. And in high dimensional search spaces, we need a lot of samples to have a reasonable fit for the potential energy surface. And therefore, it might be impossible to infer the global minimum at least for a high accuracy, because we require too many samples. And what I wanted to study is if we can develop a multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization method to approach this issue. And this means that we not only use energy calculations from one data source, from one single atomistic simulator, but we use energy calculations from other simulators which have different fidelity levels and different evaluation costs. So if there would be some correlation between these different fidelity levels, then there must be some information that we can use, or that we can include in our Bayesian optimization workflow to accelerate this overall optimization, and in particular accelerate this exploration phases that Bayesian optimization also has. So this extends this single fidelity Bayesian optimization to the multi-fidelity scenario with multiple atomistic simulators. And you can think of each fidelity level here as a different screening accuracy, or for example, one is based on force fields and one is based on the theory of, or the level of density functional theory. And each fidelity level 1 to T is then modeled with a Gaussian process model. And this time the models are not separated from each other, but they can exchange information through a shared, this shared so-called ICM kernel. Now, this ICM kernel is the kernel of this of the so-called intrinsic model of co-regionalization. This is a multi-output Gaussian process, and this model assumes that these fidelity levels are linearly correlated, and that the fidelity levels all share the same input space or the same search space. And the strength between these fidelity levels is then, or this correlation strength is then encoded into this covariance matrix B, which describes the covariances between the output spaces. And this K is then again the covariance matrix for the input space, similar as for the single fidelity scenario. Now the the scenario now that we have multiple sources also raises the question how we adapt our this Bayesian optimization workflow now that we have this different data sources. So I will go through the scenario of having two fidelity levels available, which I'm going to call, or which in this figure are called low fidelity and high fidelity. And this low fidelity data can be assumed to be can be cheaper calculated than high fidelity data, but it's also less accurate than the high fidelity data. And our goal remains that we want to infer the global minimum at the accuracy of the high fidelity level. And this I'm going to call target fidelity. And yeah, we want to make this inference computationally cheaper by using this low fidelity data, which I will call data from support fidelity. So the first approach I'm going to introduce you to is the so-called transfer learning, which consists of two steps. So the first step is that we initialize this ICM model by using data from our support fidelity source. And then we continue the Bayesian optimization normally by continue to only sample from the target fidelity level. And the idea here is to speed up the exploration phases by beginning right away with a reasonable model fit for the potential energy surface by just using this support fidelity data. The challenge here is that we need to decide in the beginning how much support fidelity data we actually want to use at this initialization, since this is not really clear, because that should ideally depend on the dimension and on the correlation between the different data sources. The second approach is called the so-called multitask learning. So here the idea is to, instead of only using the support fidelity in the initialization step, we use support fidelity throughout the whole Bayesian optimization workflow. That means that at each iteration step, we not only have to choose the sample location, but also the fidelity level where we are going to calculate the next sample from. And by this, we don't have to set, as in transfer learning, set the number of low fidelity data points in the beginning. But on the other hand, is also quite a challenge as it's not clear how we should make this decision on how we're going to choose the fidelity level that we want to sample from at each iteration step. And this is one of the key questions that I addressed in my work. So this this brings me now to my research questions. So first of all, I wanted to learn if multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization actually finds the global minimum and at the target fidelity level. And if that's the case, how efficient it is in comparison to single fidelity Bayesian optimization. Then I want to see not only if if using this ICM model or this multitask approaches, if it not only uses the number of target fidelity iterations, but also if it reduces the CPU time, because this is not clear. This ICM model comes with an additional computational cost, and we have to see if this cost if it would maybe outweigh the benefit that we would gain by using multiple data sources. And then I would like to test what kind of fidelity combinations turn out to work reasonably well. And then I would try to quantify this by the correlation and the cost difference that different simulators have. And especially in transfer learning, I also wanted to see if the amount of savings that we could obtain, if that depends on the number of initialization points. So to address these questions, I formulated the following objectives. So I began my research by a literature review where where I learned about the existing approaches and what kind of models exist, and also what kind of multitask acquisition strategies exist. And this enabled me to also formulate my own approaches and come up with my own ideas that I wanted then to implement and test. And for this, I then extended the available BOSS code with new functionalities and implemented also this multitask approaches that I was interested in. And then I concluded my research with experiments that enabled me to benchmark these different approaches, and which also served them as a proof of concept for the application of transfer learning and multitask learning in BOSS. So before the experiments, I will give you a very brief overview of the coding work that I had to conduct. So first of all, a couple more words about BOSS itself. So BOSS builds on top of the GPy library, which is a Python library that can be seen as a framework for Gaussian process regression, which also supports more advanced methods such as noisy Gaussian processes or sparse and or also multitask models. So what BOSS does, it constructs Gaussian process models by using input data and as well as user-defined settings that help users to. So what is nice about this is that a user doesn't have to have advanced knowledge about Gaussian processes but can still use them with the BOSS tool, because BOSS automatically selects according prior distributions and according to the settings file that an user provides. And in addition to this, BOSS extends this Gaussian process regression also with Bayesian optimization functionalities, which includes the handling of the acquisition functions, keeping track of convergence metrics for the global minimum, and also post-processing of results in forms of plots and also output data files. And the ICM model has been integrated already during 2019 to 2021 by Nuti Sten and Ulpo Remes into BOSS. So the first part of my coding work consisted of an extension of this library with a new subpackage that handles acquisition functions. So there I added a base template for which array acquisition functions is now constructed from. And this had to go, consolidates the functionalities about acquisition functions regarding evaluating acquisition function or also minimizing acquisition function. And yeah, since I also work with this multitask strategies, and since I had to implement many different strategies, I added another class which handled this scenario on to keep multitask approaches separate from the, I would say, from the core library, which also increases the maintainability of the overall library. And after adding these classes, I also added new acquisition functions from this entropy search family to BOSS. And because I was curious after my literature review how these functions might work in comparison to other acquisition functions that were implemented in BOSS, and also how they work out in the multi-fidelity scenario. And then I also added a new initialization for the minimizer used in BOSS, which turned out to be faster, more reliable in finding the correct minimum of the acquisition function. And last but not least, an important part of coding practices is to test or to validate your code. So I also added some unit tests to test parts of the code on correctness. So after all this theory and computational implementation work comes the interesting part of the experiments, where we will learn about how well these approaches work in practice. So the system I investigated, which is familiar to many of you, is the alanine conformer search task. So I applied Bayesian optimization for conformer search. So in particular, I wanted to find the global minimum of the potential energy surface that is spanned by these 4 dihedral angles. And I applied the Bayesian optimization to the scenario where I'm keeping 2 of these 4 dihedrals fixed, and where I'm gonna, and another scenario where I'm gonna optimize over all 4 dihedrals. And this enabled me to test how multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization performs independence of the search space dimension. So for the calculation of the potential energies, I used 3 different simulators. So the first one is based on force fields. This one is going to denote as low fidelity. The second one is based on density functional theory, which I'm going to denote as high fidelity. And the third level, this is the most accurate one, is going to be called ultra high fidelity. And this one is going to be based on quantum chemistry. So for the 2-dimensional search task, or for the 2-dimensional optimization, I plotted the potential energy surface here after 100 iterations for each of these 3 fidelity levels. And when, you can see that there are many similarities in the structure of the landscape. For example, for HF and for high fidelity and ultra high fidelity, We even have the global minimum is even in the same region in the search space. And yeah, we can in general expect that there's a lot of information about the structure of the search space that we can learn from low fidelity calculations. And this triangle here then shows the relationship between these three simulators. So on the side of the triangle, you see the Pearson correlation coefficients between the energy values. And we see that all values are above 0.9. And this shows that there's a very high linear correlation between these energy values. So yeah, remember that this ICM model that we use here in this case assumed that the models are linearly have a linear relationship. So it's a reasonable choice for this task to choose as a model. And finally, what's quite interesting here is the difference in the computation times, which is in this gray boxes here. So we see that for low fidelity, one energy calculation takes 1 to 2 seconds. For high fidelity, this takes about 30 seconds, both on a single CPU core. And if we calculate one energy value at the ultra high fidelity level, then this takes 3 to 4 hours on 40 CPU cores. So we see that there's a huge difference between these fidelity levels. And yeah, we want to infer the global minimum at this ultra high fidelity accuracy, but of course using the least amount of samples possible from the simulator, since it's so much more expensive than all the other simulators, or these other two simulators here. So two things of our interest. So first of all, if the global minimum is found, and also how fast it will be found. And we consider a global minimum as found once it stays within a certain convergence tolerance. Now, since the Bayesian optimization algorithm depends on the initialization, which is typically in BOSS is typically done by choosing 2 or 5 random points, I tested different random initializations so we can evaluate the average success of these approaches. And yeah, then I'm going to repeat this 5 times. And yeah, due to this, yeah, only 5 times because of this high computational cost that this ultra high fidelity level brings with itself. So here I'm going to show you how the results are going to be visualized. So on the y-axis here in both plots here, you see the required resources to find the global minimum. So here in the upper plot, I'm measuring this in Bayesian optimization iteration steps. So how many Bayesian optimization iterations have been required to find the global minimum. And in the lower plot, I'm measuring this in CPU time. And I'm summarizing each experiment. So each experiment was repeated 5 times. And I'm summarizing these 5 experiments in form of box plots. So if you would sort the convergence values, then the box plot shows the lower, this colored region shows the lower 25% up to the upper 75% of convergence values. And this cross here then denotes this cross on the box plot denotes the average convergence values. And here on the x-axis, I show the corresponding experiment. So here this blue box is the baseline experiment that we benchmark the multi-fidelity experiments against. In this case, I used high fidelity as the level that I wanted to infer the global minimum for, which you let's see. Now it should work. Yes, here high fidelity. So this is the level we want to infer the energy for. And so this is our target fidelity level in this case. And here this notation with this low LF arrow to HF indicates that I'm using low fidelity as support fidelity for this initialization step of the ICM model, and then continue only sampling from the high fidelity, since here this is the target fidelity level. So here are all the results from transfer learning summarized, both for the 2-dimensional experiments and also for the 4-dimensional experiments. And we in all of these experiments, the global minimum has been found. So that means we have to compare these experiments by their efficiency. And what I forgot to mention here in this plot here was that this 50 in the legend here refers to using 50 points at the initialization step of the transfer learning experiment. So yeah, back to the transfer learning experiments. So in 2D, I tested 50 points for the initialization, and in the 4D experiments, I tested 100 points and also 200 points for the initialization. And here in this left figures, in this left columns here, I am showing experiments where I'm using always the high fidelity here as baseline. So here we wanted to infer the global minimum at high fidelity accuracy. And here I was able to use low fidelity as support fidelity. And in this right columns, I'm showing experiments where I infer the global minimum at the ultra high fidelity accuracy, where I was able to test both the low fidelity here as support and also the high fidelity as support to test the effect that the correlation between different fidelities had. So yeah, so first of all, the 2D and the 4D experiments are very similar. So I'm gonna discuss only the 4D experiments here, 4D results here. So the first thing that we can note is that if we have high fidelity as the target fidelity level, then the number of Bayesian optimization iterations here is going down while the CPU time is actually going up. And this is happening because here the evaluation gap between low fidelity and high fidelity is not large enough to overcome the additional computational cost that we induce by using this ICM model. So here this additional computational cost is not in this scenario would not be recommended to, or at least for the transfer learning scenario here, would not be recommended to use transfer learning. On the other hand, if we use ultra high fidelity as our target fidelity, then the CPU time also shrinks very drastically. So here in the best scenario, we see that that it shrinks actually by 90%. And here the reason is that the ultra high fidelity computation time is just so large that this extra computation time from the ICM model is irrelevant. So the transfer learning experiments in summary depend on, first of all, the correlation between the fidelities. We see here on the x-axis here that we had very high savings if we use high fidelity as our support fidelity, which had a correlation of, I think, 0.99, which is very, very high, of course. And we had larger savings here than if we would use this low fidelity, which still had a strong correlation, but not as strong as high fidelity as a support fidelity. And we also see that that for this high fidelity scenario here, the number of initialization points, or if we choose 100 or 200, was not as important as it was the case if we would use low fidelity as our support fidelity level. Yes, and of course, also the savings depend on how large this gap between the fidelity levels is, right? Because here we saw that here the gap was not large enough, while if we have ultra high fidelity, then we have a lot of computational savings that we can gain through this approach. So now the transfer learning has shown a huge potential of using multi-fidelity Bayesian optimization in general. The question is if we might even get better than that, and also if we can avoid the effect of choosing the number of initialization points. And this brings me to multitask learning, which required me to think about how this acquisition rule should be extended to use all data sources simultaneously instead of using support fidelity data only in the beginning. So now we not only have to choose the sample location, but also the fidelity level, which we want to evaluate. And this choice should ideally take the correlation between the fidelity levels into account, and also the cost of evaluating a certain fidelity level. So imagine now the scenario that we already know the next sample location that we want to acquire a sample from, but we now have to decide which fidelity level we want to calculate the sample at. And one approach to pick the next fidelity level is to maximize this so-called information gain per cost. This quantity G at this next sample location X star, which is now kept fixed. So this quantity in the numerator, here we have the covariance between the fidelity level T and our target fidelity level T prime. And this covariance term contains the correlation between fidelities. So this term would be small if the fidelity levels would not be very correlated. In that case, we would favor to sample the target fidelity level itself, since the support fidelity is not very correlated with the target fidelity level. And but of course, this term would always be the largest if we would sample the target fidelity level itself. And to avoid this, we also divide by the simulation cost, this quantity C of t here, which is the CPU time in, I think it's in seconds. And so with this, we obtain a quantity that describes a trade-off between information and cost of evaluating fidelity level, as a certain fidelity level. And this using this information gain per cost was an idea by Ulpo Remes, who is also one of the main developers of the BOSS library. So the first class of multitask learning approaches that I decided to implement and test is what I call separable multitask learning approaches, because here the location X and the fidelity level T are going to be chosen in separate steps. And in the interest of time, I will only speak about the approaches that turned out to work best. And these are going to correspond to this orange highlighted branches. So in the upper branch here, we first pick a sample location. And we do this once again by minimizing the acquisition function of our target fidelity level. And I was interested to see if instead of only using the global minimum of this acquisition function, I also tested a second approach where I'm going to use all the local minima of this acquisition function. And then I'm in the scenario where I'm going to use the global minimum, which is this approach number 1 here. I continue by choosing the fidelity level T that maximizes this quantity information gain per cost that I just introduced you to. And in the scenario, this is this multitask approach that I mentioned before that Ulpo has been working on. And in this approach number 3, I'm using all the local minima from the acquisition function, and I maximize the information gain per cost for all the local minima, and then pick the tuple X and T for which this combination would, for which this quantity would get the maximum, obtain the maximum value. So these 2 out of these 5 approaches turned out to work best. And so in general, using the target fidelity acquisition function, which is done here in this step, to obtain the sample location in combination with this information gain per cost, which is done here and here, turned out to be a reasonable choice for the separable strategies. Then secondly, I tested inseparable approaches. As inseparable means that the location X and the fidelity level T are going to be chosen simultaneously instead of in separable steps by optimizing over some joint quantity. So in the multi-fidelity scenario, we have a posterior model for each fidelity level, and for each fidelity level, for each model, we can then construct an acquisition function. And if we would normalize all these models to the same scale, then we can actually compare the acquisition functions directly with each other and pick the and optimize basically overall fidelity levels simultaneously. So what we do here in this approach number 6 is we pick the tuple X and T where we would find the minimum acquisition value over all fidelity levels. Then briefly mentioning maybe this approach 7 and 8. So the 7th approach here is maximizing the information gain per cost, but I'm keeping X as another free parameter. But yeah, this is not the whole story, but it also didn't work that well, so I'm not gonna speak more about this. And this approach number 8 is an extension of the max value entropy search acquisition function to the multitask scenario. It was basically in particular designed for this multi-fidelity scenario, and this is also something I was curious about and also wanted to test. So the problem here is that I had 8 approaches, and I wanted to test it for 2D and 4D. So this would be these are way too many experiments to conduct for with this expensive ultra high fidelity simulator. So I had to conduct pre-screening experiments, and there I filtered out which experiments I wanted to continue to test. So I was able to reduce this 8 approaches to 3 approaches. And here I'm going to show the convergence statistics for these 3 best approaches. First, for the 2-dimensional optimization problem here. So again, as box plots here, and here the y-axis is actually the the relative resource with respect to single fidelity baseline, and also on a logarithmic scale, so we can better compare. We would better see the difference between the best working approaches. But I'm not going to speak in detail now about the differences on this approach here, because I will do this in a moment in direct comparison with the transfer learning experiments. But you can see here that this time I did in transfer learning, I only tested one acquisition function, this ELCB acquisition function. And this time I tested the ELCB, this max value entropy search, and this multitask extension, this Mumbo acquisition function. And we see similar as in the transfer learning scenario, that if we have the high fidelity as our target level, that the CPU time is actually increased, because this is a relative CPU time here, and here we are above 1.0, which means it's more expensive than the single fidelity scenario. So yeah, this was the same as in transfer learning. And again, if we have ultra high fidelity here as our target fidelity level, then we see again that there are computational savings in the CPU time possible. And also similar as in transfer learning, we see that the savings are larger. We only require about, here about maybe 20% of the resources if we have high fidelity as our support fidelity level, while for low fidelity, the savings are not as large. But this was the same as in transfer learning, right? That we saw that the correlation between the fidelities had a big impact. And quite interestingly, in the 4-dimensional optimization problem, the situation is a bit different. So similar as in transfer learning, high fidelity target fidelity is again more expensive, but for ultra high fidelity, we once again have a lot of CPU time savings. And very interestingly here is to see that this time both the low fidelity and the high fidelity are comparable in how much savings they enable. So this means that for this so in 4-dimensional optimization, the situation was different than in a 2-dimensional scenario, because here, as I said before, if we had high fidelity as our target fidelity level, then we saw an increase in the CPU time again. But interestingly, here was that in this 4-dimensional multitask learning, in this 4-dimensional problem, the correlation between the fidelities didn't seem to be that important anymore, because we can see here for both this low fidelity and high fidelity as support fidelity, we saw similar savings, which was quite surprising to me. But that means that in multitask learning, the correlation wasn't that important anymore. And for the amount of savings that we were able to get through this multi-fidelity learning approach. So now, as I said, I'm going to directly compare these transfer learning and multitask learning experiments. So what you see in this plot here, each vertical stripe here is one experiment, or contains the average convergence times for one experiment. So in orange, you see the multitask learning experiments, and blue, the transfer learning experiments. And the cross and the dot here correspond to the mean and the median convergence times of a given experiment. And on the x-axis, you see the fidelity combination that I've used in this experiments, and on the y-axis, the relative cost with respect to the baseline. And I've ordered these convergence times by their value to see if there would be any trend going on, to see if something is particularly important for the amount of savings that we can have. And if you look at the x-axis for this two-dimensional experiments, we see that it's very important here, not only important, but the most savings are obtained if we use high fidelity as our support fidelity level, while if we use this low fidelity as support fidelity level, the savings were not as large. So yeah, here the correlation seems to be plays a very important role. And yeah, the most successful approaches here were this approach number 6, this multitask approach 6, this inseparable approach, and also transfer learning with using high fidelity as support fidelity. And for the situation is a bit different. So here, if we look at the x-axis, then both low fidelity and high fidelity enabled huge savings. So here we see high fidelity for the scenario where we use transfer learning. Let me start with that. For transfer learning, the correlation was very important because here we see the highest savings if we have high fidelity as our support fidelity level, while if we use low fidelity for transfer learning, the savings were much worse than many other approaches. While what was quite interesting to see is that for multitask learning, we enabled the largest savings by in this scenario with using low fidelity as support. And we see that it didn't really matter if we use high fidelity or low fidelity. And it also turned out again that this approach number 6, this dark orange here, and this approach number 1, this separable approach, were quite enabled the largest savings. So we saw that the correlation is important in 2D while it's less important in 4D, and that multi-fidelity learning in general enables a lot of savings. And we saw that in transfer learning that this number of initialization points is important or more important if the correlation is not very strong, while it turned out to be more important if the correlation, it turned out to be more important if the correlation is not as strong, and less important if the correlation was stronger. So as a summary, one can say that this work served as a proof of concept that there's a huge potential in the application of multitask and transfer learning, and to enable a lot of savings. And we saw that this ultra high fidelity level is now, we can find this global minimum, and the global minimum of this level now in a matter of a couple of hours instead of 10 days, which was previously the case. And future work might be about that this should be tested on other systems and maybe on other tasks. I don't know, maybe something like an absorption task or something, and then maybe consider using other models. The ICM model was built up on the assumption that the fidelity levels are linearly correlated. So maybe in some systems, the correlation is not linear. So there would be interesting to see other approaches, and also would be maybe interesting to see this max value entropy search and also this MUMBO, this multitask extension of max value entropy search to a lot more applications to see how well they work in practice. So this concludes my presentation. And at the end, I want to thank my advisors for this excellent guidance that I had throughout this thesis project, and also of course, for making it possible that I was able to do this thesis in Finland. So